Hey folks, today we're going to do something pretty cool. If you're into networking, this is definitely a video for you. We're going to be turning this HP thin client into a PFSense box, which I'm going to use as a firewall and a router, amongst other things, I guess. This is basically what you would do to make your own router, to make your own network infrastructure. You don't have to necessarily use a thin client to do this. You can use any PC. But I chose a thin client because they're small. And this particular HP thin client, which is the T620 Plus, acts more like a computer than it does a thin client. It has an M.2 and an mSATA SSD slot in them. So you can just run this off of flash storage, which is what I'm doing. It has a 16 gig one in here right now. And as you can see, this particular one has an array of ports on it. I stuck this Intel Ethernet card in here. It's a gigabit card. But it also has a port of its own. It has a good array of ports on it, which is nice. Dual display port, which is pretty cool. So this is what I'm going to use for a PFSense box. You can use a smaller thin client than this. You can use a full desktop. You can use a rack mount server. You can use pretty much anything that'll run an x86 operating system to make a PFSense box. So I'm choosing this thin client, which is based on an AMD chip. But one thing you should be aware of with PFSense is that I believe newer versions of it require AES-NI, which is an encryption standard. So what I would do, I would make sure your processor supports that before you even think about partaking on a project like this. These HP thin clients do support it, so lucky for me, that's what's going to happen here. So here's the whole setup. Let's take this into the other room and actually talk about it some more. So let's take this into here and talk about it some more. So this HP thin client is going to go next to my bed where my Verizon router is now. So next to my bed here I have this Verizon router that I bought when I moved into this place, and it's been a great router. I haven't had a lick of trouble out of it. It runs a build of Linux from scratch, so the firmware on it's very good. And the wireless on it's been good, the networking's been good, it doesn't have any trouble. It never resets itself unless it gets a firmware update, which it gets them sort of on the fly. But it doesn't have all the functionality that I'm looking for. It doesn't really have much firewall. It actually has decent firewall functionality, but it doesn't have quite the full firewall functionality that a PFSense box would have. And it does not have a way to configure a VPN as the central point of your network. This PFSense box takes care of that. It has good firewall features, and it also allows you to connect to a VPN as a central point in your network. Now, why would you want to connect to a VPN in the central point of your network? Well, the VPN service I use is AirVPN, and using them as an example, they only allow 3 concurrent connections to some VPN servers using their service at once. So if you can't run a VPN centrally, you're stuck with only being able to use 3 clients at once, which normally wouldn't be that big of a deal, I guess. But if you configure the VPN on the PFSense box, you can use one VPN server for every device in your house, which is nice because I don't have to worry about the VPN client on each computer. I don't have to worry about setting any of that up. I can just go into the configuration in PFSense and turn the VPN on, and then whatever device I'm using, whether it's supported or not by the software, will work with it. So it eliminates headaches, and it eliminates the 3 concurrent connection limit. So that's a good reason to use a PFSense box. The other good reason to use a PFSense box is that you get regular updates to the firmware. The manufacturer of, let's say, a router like that one could just abandon that model, and you'll lose support, and you'll lose firmware updates. So let's say you have an old wireless N access point. They could abandon that access point and not update it for the crack vulnerability, which is exactly what's happened to some of my wireless access points, which is a shame. So how are we going to set this whole thing up? That's the purpose of using a PFSense box. It's just better functionality and better features. So how would a network setup like this work? So obviously the thin client that I'm using, or in your case or somebody else's case, the computerized device that they're using, would act as the firewall and the router. So what I would do is get yourself a 4-port gigabit Ethernet card and use that on the router and use the built-in port. You could, I don't know. I've been told by Sansui 350A here on YouTube that using this as a WAN port is probably a bad idea, and to use one of the 4 on the card as a WAN port and use that for the wireless access point. So that card's going to be key into getting a PFSense box working, and I recommend using Intel cards for that, as they're very stable and they work well. So you have this as your central box, so to speak. Now the other thing you need, if you want wireless at all, is you need a wireless access point. So I decided to buy a TP-Link wireless AC 1750 based access point, which is the same wireless technology that's in the Verizon router, so I'm not downgrading at all. I got this for $50 refurbished. So what I'm going to do is, there's a plate to mount this to the wall, but I don't think I'm going to mount this to the wall. But what's cool about these is that you can use PoE with these, or you can just use the power adapter. I'm going to be using the power adapter personally. So yeah, that's the whole setup. This is what replaces your router. A WAP and a PFSense box. Now the advantage to using a WAP instead of putting a wireless card in your PFSense box is that the WAP it's easier to upgrade the WAP. So let's say you want to upgrade to wireless AX or something, and you know, AC is out of date now. You just replace the WAP, configure your wireless, done. You don't have to take your network down and open this thing up and put a card in and all that stuff. You can keep everything up and running and just replace the WAP, like a swap in, swap out situation. So that's very nice. So what I'm gonna do is install PFSense on this and set it up, and if there's anything interesting, I'll show you what it looks like. Alright, I've got this whole setup set up on my dining room table like a real gentleman, and we're going to stick PFSense on this whole setup. I have a Dell monitor with HDMI. I have a DisplayPort to HDMI adapter for that monitor. Got power supply for the thin client here. Got this ridiculous wood keyboard plugged in. We're going to use that because it was the most available. And I have a micro SD card, a 4 gig micro SD card with the PFSense image on it that we're going to use to install. So let's boot this up and see what she does. I have yet to turn this thing on. There it goes. Let's see if I can get to the BIOS. I want to say it's F2 or escape on these HPs. BIOS setup is F10, that's right. Alright, so pretty typical HP BIOS. This is the chip that's in this thing. It's an AMD GX 420CA SoC with Radeon HD graphics. So I'm literally using AMD everything on this because AMD was kind enough to put AES-NI support into this chip. It's a 2 gigahertz processor. It has 4 gigs of DDR3 in it, which came in it. That's plenty for a firewall and a router, I think. So we should be fine there. Now, what else do we want? So, storage. Here's what we have. We have a 16 gigabyte SSD for this system. What's the storage options? So it's on HCI, that's good. Boot order. So it'll do Uefi and Legacy, of course, so it's helpful there. So the built-in network controller is Realtek on this particular machine, and of course the one in the slot, which is the one I'm going to be using for the WAN port and for some other ports for a laptop and for the rest of my network, are on the Intel card that I've installed. You can have a setup password, a power on password, a bunch of different stuff. Trusted computing. That's turned off. That's good. Never going to need that. Power management. So, yeah, SATA power management's on. Can I... Power on options. So, after power loss, we want that turned on, of course. So whenever the power goes out, the network will come back up. That's why you want that. So I think it's F9 to boot from the USB. So let's try that. Come on, you can do it. All right, will it boot from? Does PFSense boot from Uefi? Let's see. Wow, it does. Cool. Question is, will it actually install properly from Uefi? That I don't know. We'll see what happens. I'm going to try installing it via Uefi and see if it boots without the need for an external USB stick or something. Hopefully it doesn't. That would be a real pain in the ass if it did. But as you can see, PFSense looks remarkably like FreeBSD booting out. And that's because it is. PFSense is FreeBSD based. It is not Linux. It is very nice. So install PFSense. Default key map. Okay, so looks like it'll just partition it for you. This is a fairly straightforward installer. Do I want UFS or ZFS? ZFS is a better file system, so we're going to go with that. The GPT. Alright, mirror swap, encrypt swap, no. Kind of new to this, so I don't know what I'm doing. Don't use this as a guide. I'm just going to see what happens. Not enough disks selected. Let's put it on that. Alright. It's going to install. Now it's installing PFSense on there. The installer for this is very straightforward. Very, very easy. It's easier than installing a Linux distro. You just have to know what UFS and ZFS are. So, there you go. We're installing onto the PFSense box right now. You can see the activity light doing its thing. Sorry for the background noise, by the way. I'm surrounded by air conditioners and fans, so it's hot and I don't want to sweat, so there you go. The installation is now finished. Would you like to open a shell in the new system to make any final modifications? No. Alright, so let's reboot and see if it boots correctly, and that's when we can configure it. Oh, it's trying to boot off of the USB stick again. That's not what we want. So let's shut this off and turn it back on. See if it boots from the SSD this time. Oh, there we go. Yep, booting just fine from the SSD. Yep, that's working great. So ZFS with in the Uefi mode works just fine with this. There you go, PFSense. All right, so now we have a working box. As you can see, it's configuring stuff at the moment. Now it's trying to get the WAN interface. Look at that. You can also use this for VLANs, which is kind of nice. Although, all you really need for VLANs are a switch, a managed switch. Supports DHCP v6, of course. And there you go. PFSense is booted up. Alright, let's see if I can log into the web interface without doing anything first. Okay, so when PFSense first boots up, you get this menu. You don't have to touch anything here. You can leave it all alone. It'll assign you an IP address for the LAN port, which for me is this particular port on the Ethernet card. It's port number 2. Well, it's port 1 as opposed to port 0, I guess. And if you connect a laptop like this to it, it'll just connect. You don't have to assign a static IP or anything like that. It'll just work. So I don't know what the default username and password are for PFSense, but it looks like I can reset the web configurator password there. I'm gonna guess it's admin password or something. Let's test that theory, shall we? Damn it. Well, if you get it wrong, it shows up on the console, so that's kind of cool. Let me find out what the default login information is. Well, I was close. The default is admin PFSense. Make sure to change that once you have, gotten everything the way you like it. Alright, next. Yada yada yada, Netgate support. So this is where you choose the host name and the domain and all that kind of crap. DNS servers. So wow. Alright, well, this is where I start configuring. So I'm going to configure everything, put in the DNS servers that I want, and all that kind of stuff. So I'll be back once I'm done configuring all this. Wow, look how small of an update that is. Let's see what updating looks like on PFSense. So this is the advantage of something like PFSense. It'll just update like this. On my Verizon router, you wouldn't see anything like this. You would see... It would just update by itself. And that's if there was a firmware update available. I would say that that Verizon router gets updated maybe once or twice a year, and that's it. Upgrade is complete. There you go. So it's going to reboot the machine, it looks like, and then it'll be updated. Terminated. Ah! Alright, let's do it. It said system update failed. But I think it's working, maybe? That's weird. We'll see what happened there. I might have just screwed up my entire PFSense install. But these error messages aren't always accurate, so we shall see. 2.4.3-release. It might not have updated. That's weird. I guess it is. I don't know. I don't know what's going on. I'll come back when it's done. Okay, so that's interesting. It does say patch 1 at the end of the release there. So let's see if this was full of crap but it actually worked. So, alright, so I had to unplug the WAN interface because I couldn't get back in here. But that update failed thing, I think was full of crap because it worked. FreeBSD 11.1 release P10. There you go. AES&I. There's the thing I mentioned earlier. It's not turned on, but it's there. I don't know if I have to turn that on in the BIOS manually or whatever. I'll have to figure that out. Okay, so PFSense is working. The next step is to configure this WAP. So, I've got to plug this guy in, plug the laptop into it, log into the web interface, and configure this for Wi-Fi, which if you've done this before, it's no big deal. You just select your SSID, the encryption standard you want, and then you're done. Bada bing, bada boom. So I'm going to do that real quick. Alright, many frustrations and help from Sansui350A later, well, some of it anyway, because he knows PFSense a little better than I do, and pointed out a few things that I've taken note of. We're up and running. Let me move this otter out of the way. So here's what the setup looks like. I have the PFSense box here, this little HP thin client, and it's humming away. I have, what I did to make multiple ports work on this is I bridged a bunch together. I bridged all but one. One I actually put in a separate subnet just in case I need it for whatever reason. Let's say I blow up the bridge by accident when configuring it like I did before. And I need to get into the router or the PFSense box somehow. That's a way to do it. Plus, if I need to isolate stuff on my network, that's a good reason to have that. I have it on a separate subnet. I can put rules in the firewall that make it a little bit more friendly for isolation and things like that. So, yeah, pretty cool. So, I'm using 3 of the ports on the Ethernet card. For one of them's the WAN port, and then 3 of them are LAN ports, almost acting like a switch because I bridged most of them together apart from one, as we mentioned earlier. I'm using the built-in Ethernet port for the WAP, this TP-Link WAP, which is an excellent WAP. I configured this thing to have 3 networks. One is my regular network that's 2.4, one is my regular network that's 5 gigahertz, and I also have a guest network, which has SSID isolation on it, which it's awesome that this thing supports, so I can have a proper guest network. And as far as PFSense stuff goes, I think this looks pretty tidy. It's a nice little setup here, so I've come into the real world, so to speak, on networking. We're done with, at least for now, I'm done with my Verizon router, but I just needed that at the time because it had wireless AC support. And now that I could get a WAP that was good, this was able to happen. Plus, I was able to find an HP thin client with AES-NI on the supported by the CPU. You do have to turn that on in the settings in PFSense, by the way. So, yeah. So this is my setup. I sort of cover up the LED with this otter, this stuffed otter here. That, and the otter guards the WAP. He is the guardian of the WAP. And that's the setup now. It doesn't look too offensive, I think. Well, this is a pretty messy looking nightstand, so there is that. Anyhow, this has been a success. I've been using this internet for a while, haven't had a single problem with it. And I like it a lot because I can update the software whenever I want. I'm not at the mercy of Verizon for updates or the manufacturer for updates. PFSense is a community-driven open source, maybe open source idea. It's BSD. It's basically just free BSD, so there you have it. Upgraded network infrastructure to something that's a real network. Anyhow, maybe this will inspire some of you to do this yourself. You can do this with all kinds of different equipment. But again, you need to make sure that the CPU supports AES-NI. Because once version 2.5 of PFSense comes out, it will not support anything that does not have that. So, you know, just be careful what you buy and what you use, and you should be fine. So this has been a successful upgrading of my network. Hope you enjoyed this video, and have a good one, everybody. Ciao.